Who has a role in God's plan? Well, I think it's easy or safe to start with the disciples. The disciples who are the audience for today's gospel reading, that is the final 3 verses of Jesus' mission discourse in chapter 10 of Matthew's gospel. This is the end of a speech that we actually started hearing 2 weeks ago. Jesus went about all the cities and the villages, teaching in the synagogues, and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness, when he called the 12 apostles by name, sending them out, like sheep amongst the wolves, to cure the sick, to raise the dead, to cleanse the lepers, to cast out demons. He sends them to stay at places that offer them peace, and otherwise to brush off the dust from their feet and keep moving. For it will be worse for those towns than for the inhospitable Old Testament communities of Sodom and Gomorrah, if hospitality is not extended. Last week, Jesus continued this discourse. A student is not above their teacher, nor a slave above their master. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both body and soul. Today is the end of that discourse to the apostles. Those named at the beginning of the chapter, those who obviously have a role in God's plan. The word apostle comes from the Greek apostolos, means one sent out. Now, according to ancient texts, prophets were seen as representatives of Christ himself, which is what we see in today's reading. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. This echoes the gospel reading from 2 weeks ago about the harsh punishment for those communities where the apostles might be turned away, harassed, or attacked. Since they represent Christ, the communities would not just be inhospitable to the apostles, but also to Jesus himself, and therefore to God who sent them out. On the other side of that, whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet, which would then be the name of Christ, would receive that reward. Paul in his letters, the epistles, relies heavily on this idea that Jesus is teaching the apostles right here and now. Paul writes in a number of different ways across his correspondence that one should regard servants of Christ as the stewards of the mysteries of God. But to be fair, again, that's Paul, and Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus and changed the trajectory of his life forever. But what about those of us who might not be on the apostle or on the Paul side of the equation? Who else has a role in God's plan? I think to answer this, Jesus continues. He continues, whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. The reward is the reward of faith, the reward of hospitality. But here's the question. Who are the righteous? I often say in Bible study that all of the apostles are disciples, but not all of the disciples in the Bible were apostles, since that term is used for those specific 12 that Jesus called by name. So maybe Jesus is setting up a system here. Maybe Jesus is commissioning prophets and righteous within the ranks of the apostles to send them out. Maybe some of the apostles are prophets while some of them are simply righteous. Or maybe, and this is how I tend to read this, Jesus is widening the view of the apostles to include others that they might meet on the road, others who are also doing good work. It's like Jesus is saying, you 12 have your jobs, but there are others too, others who are righteous and should be received and treated thusly. When we think about worship or about our church, there are different roles. I am a called pastor, set in that role. We have our choir director and our organist and our office administrator who are all hired for different kinds and styles of missions and ministries in our community. Then there are the board and council members, not to mention all the other volunteers behind the scenes that do so much and yet might not want to sit on a board. Now, righteous, as Jesus is using in our gospel today, is defined as equitable, and by implication, innocent or holy. So, whereas a prophet should be welcomed as a representative of Christ, a Christ bearer, if you will, so too should the righteous also be sent and welcomed as Christ bearers, which they are too, for they too have a role in God's plan and in God's ministry. So, okay, Jesus is talking to the apostles, preparing them for a life of ministry in motion, equipping them for whatever might lay ahead. And as Jesus brings this discourse to a close, he includes the line, "And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple." But let me stop there because I think this is a tricky part. Because nowhere in this chapter do we, the reader, get the idea that there is a big crowd or even children present for this discourse. In fact, I think that what we have is the opposite. Chapter 10 starts, "Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits." So here, in an odd turn of phrase, I believe that Jesus is referring to the apostles that he is talking to with the phrase, "these little ones." The apostles are the ones who are the little ones. See, Jesus is saying that anyone who does a kindness to you, the apostles, will surely not lose their reward either. Jesus is returning them to the theme of hospitality that was underlined with the mentions of Sodom and Gomorrah just a few verses back. Beyond that, Jesus is widening the apostles' view for those who have a role in God's plan. It's not just the apostles or just the disciples or just the righteous or even solely the members of the religious communities, but any and all who support those communities and individuals in a host of ways both big and small. I have a good friend named Noah who lives close to our church. Noah is a great guy and always ready to help out at a moment's notice. Last year, when I was getting together my list of volunteers for our Run to Church 5K, Noah shot me a text that said, "Hey man, I know you're looking for volunteers, and I would love to do that. And I also have some water coolers, so if you need someone to set up a water station, I got it. Just tell me when and where." Noah was on the corner of Maplewood and Doney last year for that very event. Many of you might have walked by him and received a cup of cold water. To us, small ones, to those in this community, there's a role in God's plan for Noah. There are other places in Matthew's Gospel where the phrase little ones is obviously and specifically about children, though to jump to that conclusion in today's reading misses a wider invitation of God into God's plan for all of humanity. There are those who are the prophets, there are also the righteous, there are also the little ones. Those who might feel small or insignificant, those who might feel like they don't measure up or are far from righteous. There are those who might not know or care what prayer to say when or when to stand or sit or kneel, and yet those who offer the simplest of kindness, those who want to help and seek to make the world a better place in their own way. Myself, even as a pastor in our Lutheran church, some days I feel like life is a sliding scale. Some days I feel prophetic, and some days I feel righteous, and other days I barely feel like a little one, or one of the least of these, to borrow another phrase. I think life has ways of doing that to all of us in one way or another. Though through it all, however we might feel day to day, or wherever we are in our lives or on our spiritual journey, Christ calls to us just the same. Christ loves us just the same. And Christ has a role for each and every one of us in God's plan. So here's my word for you today. Wherever you are today, Christ loves you just the same and will do so forever and ever. Amen.